There are stories the Wehrmacht tried to erase from their war diaries, events too unsettling to record, too irrational to explain within the logic of military doctrine. In the winter of 1944, somewhere in the dense forests of the Ardennes, a German infantry company reported something that should not have existed. A lone American soldier who hunted at night with methods no army manual had ever taught. He left no footprints in the snow. He made no sound. And when he struck, entire squads vanished into the frozen darkness, leaving only scattered equipment and the faint metallic smell of fear. The official Wehrmacht logs listed these losses as patrol casualties or weather-related disappearances. But the soldiers who survived those weeks knew better. They had seen the tracks that appeared and vanished. They had heard the silence that fell over the radio frequencies just before another unit went dark. They had found the bodies arranged in ways that violated every rule of battlefield engagement, positioned as warnings, not as victories. The German command dismissed the reports as panic, as the collective hallucination of exhausted men pushed beyond their psychological limits. But the pattern was undeniable. Between December 18th and December 27th, 1944, 17 separate German patrols reported encounters with what they called der Jäger, the hunter. 12 of those patrols never returned. The 5 that did were transferred immediately to rear positions, their testimonies sealed in files that would remain classified for 43 years. The Americans never claimed credit for these operations. There was no unit citation, no Medal of Honor, no after-action report filed with Allied command. When questioned decades later, surviving officers from the 101st Airborne and the 2nd Infantry Division denied any knowledge of specialized night operations in that sector. The area was supposed to be a quiet zone, a buffer between active combat positions. No sniper teams were authorized, no reconnaissance patrols were scheduled, yet something moved through those forests with predatory precision, and it wore an American uniform. The first confirmed encounter occurred on December 18th near the village of Trois Ponts. A German squad of 9 men, veterans of the Eastern Front, set out on a routine night patrol to map American defensive positions. They were equipped with standard winter gear, armed with Kar-98K rifles and 2 MP-40 submachine guns. Their commander, Unteroffizier Klaus Richter, was known for his competence and his absolute refusal to tolerate superstition among his men. He returned alone 3 hours later, his face grey with something beyond fatigue, unable to speak coherently for 6 hours. When he finally gave his report, he described a presence that moved parallel to his squad for 20 minutes before making contact. No visual confirmation, no sound, just the awareness that something intelligent was pacing them through the trees. His men felt it too. They tightened formation, increased their alert level, kept their weapons ready. Then the point man disappeared. No shot fired, no struggle, no cry. One moment he was 5 meters ahead, the next he was gone. The squad rushed forward and found his rifle leaning against a tree, carefully positioned. His tracks ended mid-stride, as if he had been lifted straight up into the darkness. Richter ordered an immediate withdrawal. As his men retreated, they heard footsteps matching their pace exactly, staying just beyond visual range. When they stopped, the footsteps stopped. When they ran, the footsteps ran. 2 more men vanished during that withdrawal, plucked from the rear of the formation without anyone noticing, until the head count revealed the losses. Richter fired blindly into the forest, expended all his ammunition in a panic volley that accomplished nothing except to mark his position. He made it back to German lines alone, carrying nothing but his empty weapon and a terror that never fully left his eyes. The Wehrmacht High Command sent investigators the next morning. They found the patrol area undisturbed, except for the 3 sets of German tracks that led into the forest and simply ended. No blood, no signs of struggle, no evidence of ambush. The missing soldiers' weapons and equipment were discovered arranged in a perfect triangle 50 meters away, each item placed with deliberate care. In the center of the triangle, pressed into the snow, was a single hunting arrow, not military issue, carved from ashwood with fletching made from crow feathers. It pointed southeast toward the next German position. The arrow was removed and sent to intelligence analysts in Berlin, who confirmed it was handmade using techniques common to American wilderness hunters of the northern forests. The craftsmanship suggested expertise acquired over years, possibly decades. The wood had been fire-hardened. The stone tip was knapped from flint with obsessive precision. This was not a weapon of modern warfare. This was something older, something that predated the mechanized killing of the 20th century. Command ordered increased patrols, doubled sentries, mandatory buddy systems after dark. They distributed flashlights and flares, authorized liberal use of illumination rounds. They briefed their men on American sniper tactics, on ambush protocols, on psychological warfare techniques, but none of it helped, because the hunter was not following any doctrine they understood. He was not a soldier executing orders. He was something else entirely, something that had learned to kill in the forests of Michigan or Montana or Maine, and had brought that knowledge to the Ardennes with a precision that turned German soldiers into prey. By December 22nd, the panic had spread to 3 separate companies. Men refused night duty. Patrols had to be ordered at gunpoint. Sentries fired at shadows, at wind-moved branches, at their own imagination. The Americans noticed the increased German nervousness and assumed it was battlefield fatigue from the broader offensive. They had no idea that something was dismantling enemy morale one patrol at a time, using methods that would have been at home in the wars fought 300 years earlier, before uniforms and ranks and the industrial machinery of modern slaughter. The Wehrmacht never captured him. They never even saw him clearly. But they felt him, and that was enough to break something fundamental in their tactical confidence. The forests became enemy territory in a way that transcended military occupation. The trees themselves seemed hostile. The darkness became absolute, and somewhere in that darkness, De Jager moved with the patience of a predator who understood that fear kills more efficiently than bullets ever could. The second week of encounters began with a discovery that violated every assumption German intelligence had made about their invisible adversary. On December 23rd, a reconnaissance team stumbled upon what appeared to be a temporary camp hidden in a ravine 12 kilometers behind their own forward positions. The site was abandoned but recently used, perhaps within the last 6 hours. What they found there suggested that Der Jäger was not simply a skilled soldier employing unconventional tactics. He was operating according to principles that had nothing to do with modern warfare. The camp consisted of a shallow depression beneath a fallen oak, camouflaged so expertly that the Germans walked past it twice before one soldier noticed the unnatural symmetry of the surrounding brush. Inside, they found a bedroll made from a parachute silk, a small fire pit with cold ashes arranged to disperse smoke horizontally through the underbrush, and a collection of items that intelligence would later photograph and analyze with increasing confusion. There were no ration tins, no military supplies, no ammunition beyond a leather pouch containing 23 handmade arrows identical to the one found at the first incident site. What disturbed the investigating officers most were the personal items: a hunting knife with a bone handle, the blade worn from decades of use and regular sharpening, a compass marked with scratches that appeared to be a personal navigation system, notches indicating landmarks or patrol routes, a small journal with entries written in English, pages filled with observations about German patrol schedules, sentry rotations, and detailed sketches of the surrounding terrain, annotated with notes about wind direction, snow depth, and optimal approach vectors. The handwriting was steady, methodical, completely devoid of military terminology. The entries read like a hunter's log, documenting prey behavior rather than enemy movements. One page contained a list of names, 17 German surnames, each followed by a date, time, and brief physical description. The reconnaissance team realized with cold certainty that these were the soldiers who had disappeared. They were not casualties of war. They were documented kills, recorded with the same clinical precision a big game hunter might use to track trophy animals. Beside each name was a small mark, a tally, a confirmation. The journal made no moral judgments, offered no justification. It simply recorded facts. Target acquired, method executed, result confirmed. The German command photographed everything and immediately sealed the evidence. They could not allow this information to spread among the ranks. The implications were too destabilizing. If their men learned that they were being hunted, not fought but actually hunted, by someone who tracked them with techniques borrowed from wilderness survival rather than military training, the psychological impact would be catastrophic. Soldiers could accept death in combat. They could accept superior firepower or tactical disadvantage. But being reduced to prey, being stalked by something that moved through their world as an apex predator rather than an equal combatant, that was something the human mind resisted with primal intensity. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We're interested to know how far and at what moments of day or night these documented accounts reach. The Wehrmacht brought in their best tracker, a former gamekeeper from Bavaria named Otto Brenner, who had spent 3 decades managing hunting estates before the war. They showed him the camp, the journal, the arrows. They asked him for a professional assessment. Brenner studied the site for 2 hours before delivering his analysis. What they were dealing with, he explained, was not a soldier. It was a hunter who had adapted his lifelong skills to a military environment. The camp discipline, the equipment selection, the documented methodology, all of it spoke to someone who had spent more time in forests than in barracks. The fire pit construction particularly impressed Brenner. It was built using a Dakota firehole method. 2 connected pits that drew air from below and burned with minimal smoke and almost no visible flame. This was not military training. This was indigenous knowledge, techniques passed down through generations of American frontier hunters. The bedroll placement took advantage of natural ground heat retention. The cache of arrows indicated someone who preferred silent kills over firearms, not for tactical reasons, but because that was how he had always hunted. The journal's handwriting showed no military abbreviations, no tactical jargon. This man thought in terms of trails and stalking patterns, not of objectives and engagement protocols. Brenner offered an unsettling conclusion. Whoever was out there had probably been hunting his entire adult life, likely in the vast wilderness regions of Northern America, where survival skills were not hobby, but necessity. The war had simply provided him with a new environment and a new type of prey. He was not adapting military tactics to wilderness survival. He was adapting wilderness survival tactics to military targets. And that inversion made him nearly impossible to counter using conventional doctrine. The German command authorized a specialized response. They assembled a counter-hunting team, 8 men with woodcraft experience, equipped with night vision equipment recently arrived from Berlin, armed with silenced weapons and trained in small unit infiltration tactics. Their mission was simple: track the hunter using his own methods, locate his position, eliminate the threat. They deployed on the night of December 24th, carrying with them the confidence that German precision and technological superiority would overcome primitive wilderness tactics. The counter-hunting team maintained radio silence for 47 minutes. At 23:17 hours, their commanding officer transmitted a brief, urgent message. Contact. Target aware. Moving to... The transmission cut off mid-sentence. Subsequent attempts to raise the team received no response. At dawn, a recovery unit found all 8 men unconscious in a small clearing, arranged in a circle facing outward. Their weapons had been removed and stacked neatly at the center. Each man had a small cut on his left hand, shallow precise, non-lethal, a symbolic gesture perhaps, a demonstration of control. When the men regained consciousness, they reported fragmented memories of the encounter. They had been tracking what they believed were fresh signs when something changed in the forest, a shift in the ambient sound, a sudden awareness of being observed from multiple angles simultaneously. Their sophisticated night vision equipment had failed to detect any heat signatures. Their motion sensors registered nothing, yet they felt surrounded, overwhelmed by a presence that moved through the darkness with absolute confidence. The last thing they remembered before losing consciousness was a sensation of pressure at the base of their skulls, precisely targeted nerve strikes delivered with such speed that none of them could react or defend themselves. Medical examination revealed no permanent damage, no drugs in their systems, nothing that explained the synchronized loss of consciousness. The precision required to disable 8 trained soldiers simultaneously without killing any of them suggested skills that transcended normal military training. This was not battlefield expertise. This was something else, the kind of knowledge that came from years of close-quarter survival, from understanding exactly how a body moves and how it can be controlled with minimal force. The German command recalled all night patrols, effective immediately. They could not continue losing men to an adversary they could neither locate nor comprehend. The Ardennes forests became a no-man's land after sunset, ceded to de Jaeger by implicit acknowledgement that they had no effective countermeasure. The Americans advanced their positions without understanding why German resistance had weakened so dramatically in this specific sector. They attributed it to supply problems or command confusion. They never knew about the hunter who had opened a corridor through enemy territory, using nothing but patience, skill, and an understanding of fear that no military academy could teach. The journal recovered from the camp contained one final entry, dated December 23rd, written in the same calm, methodical handwriting. They sent their best, found them watching the wrong places. Forrest knows the difference between a walker and a hunter. War doesn't change that. The identity of der Jäger remained a ghost file in Wehrmacht intelligence archives until December 28, 1944, when a captured American soldier provided the first concrete information, not through interrogation, but through casual conversation with a German medical orderly who spoke English. The prisoner, a corporal from the 2nd Infantry Division recovering from a minor wound, mentioned in passing that one of their scouts had gone missing 3 weeks earlier during the German offensive. A man named Elias Thorn, a replacement soldier who had arrived from the States in late November. Nobody knew much about him. He kept to himself, rarely spoke during downtime, seemed uncomfortable with standard infantry protocols. The medical orderly, sensing something significant, pressed for details. The corporal explained that Thorn had been unusual from the start. He refused to carry a standard-issue rifle, insisting on keeping his hunting bow, a recurved design he claimed to have made himself. Command had initially ordered him to store it, but after Thorn demonstrated his accuracy by putting 3 arrows through a German helmet at 80 meters in under 4 seconds, they made an exception. He wore his uniform incorrectly, modified his boots for silent movement, and carried almost no standard equipment. His pack contained items nobody recognized: dried plants, homemade tools, cord made from stripped bark. Officers thought he was eccentric, but harmless. Then the offensive began, and Thorn disappeared into the forest. The medical orderly reported this conversation immediately. Wehrmacht intelligence cross-referenced the timeline and realized with cold certainty that Elias Thorn and de Jaeger were the same person. They began investigating his background through captured American personnel files and Red Cross records. What they discovered explained everything and made the situation infinitely more disturbing. Elias Thorn was 47 years old, extraordinarily old for a frontline soldier. He'd been drafted in October 1944 during the final desperate push for manpower. Before the war, He had worked as a wilderness guide in northern Minnesota, living year-round in a remote cabin 40 miles from the nearest town. Tax records showed minimal income. Census data listed him as unmarried, no dependents, no permanent address beyond a post office box. Local officials described him as someone who appeared in civilization maybe twice a year to sell furs and purchase supplies before vanishing back into the forest. Military service records indicated Thorne had been a terrible soldier in every conventional sense. He failed basic marksmanship with rifles, showed no aptitude for formation discipline, could not memorize military protocols, and openly questioned orders that contradicted his understanding of survival tactics. His commanding officers considered him a liability, but he possessed one undeniable skill. He could move through terrain undetected. During training exercises, he routinely infiltrated secured areas, bypassed sentries, and completed objectives using methods that frustrated instructors because they could not be systematized or taught. He operated according to instincts developed over decades, not according to doctrine. The file contained a psychological evaluation conducted at Fort McCoy, Wisconsin. The examining psychiatrist noted, "Subject displays profound discomfort with social interaction and hierarchical structures. Demonstrates extreme competence in wilderness survival, but appears psychologically unsuited for military service. Recommendation, assigned to non-combat logistics role." That recommendation was ignored due to manpower shortages. Thorne was shipped to Europe with a replacement battalion and assigned to the 2nd Infantry Division, where he lasted exactly 9 days before the German offensive scattered his unit and he vanished into the Ardennes. What German intelligence now understood was that they were facing someone who had spent more of his adult life in forests than in human society. Thorne was not a soldier who happened to know hunting techniques. He was a hunter who had been forced into a war and had simply continued doing what he had always done: tracking, stalking, surviving. The only difference was that his prey now carried weapons and wore uniforms. But prey was prey, and Thorne had spent 30 years perfecting his craft in environments where mistakes meant death from exposure, starvation, or predators. The Ardennes, by comparison, was hospitable territory. The German command convened an emergency briefing. They shared Thorne's background with senior officers, hoping that understanding their adversary would suggest countermeasures. Instead, it deepened the sense of helplessness. How did you defend against someone who needed no supply lines, no support network, no communication? Thorne could survive indefinitely in the forest, using nothing but his skills. He required no resupply, no extraction plan, no coordination with Allied forces. He was a completely autonomous unit, operating according to his own logic, accountable to no command structure. Traditional military responses, cutting supply lines, disrupting communications, applying superior force, were all irrelevant. One officer suggested waiting him out, assuming Thorne would eventually return to American lines or be killed by the cold. The counter-argument was immediate. Men like Thorne did not seek human company, and Minnesota winters were far harsher than anything the Ardennes could produce. He would stay out there as long as targets remained, and every night he stayed, German morale eroded further. The psychological impact on frontline units had become critical. Soldiers were sleeping in shifts, weapons constantly ready, jumping at every sound. Officers reported increasing incidents of fratricide, German sentries shooting at other German patrols in the darkness, convinced they were being stalked. The number of self-inflicted wounds increased dramatically as men sought any excuse to escape night duty. Entire platoons requested transfers to active combat zones, preferring direct engagement with American infantry over the passive terror of waiting for der Jäger to strike. Medical officers documented a new phenomenon they called forest fever, a collective anxiety state characterized by hypervigilance, auditory hallucinations, and paranoid conviction that the surrounding environment was hostile. Soldiers reported hearing footsteps that matched their own pace, seeing movement in peripheral vision that vanished under direct observation, finding their equipment subtly disturbed despite posting sentries. Whether these experiences were real or psychological hardly mattered. The effect was the same. The German forces in this sector were being psychologically dismantled by a single individual who understood fear as intimately as he understood forests. Intelligence analysts noted an interesting pattern in Thorn's documented kills. He never struck the same way twice. Methods varied constantly, sometimes quick nerve strikes, sometimes patient stalking ending in arrow strikes from concealment, sometimes elaborate psychological operations where targets were separated from their units and left disoriented but alive. This unpredictability prevented pattern recognition, made countermeasures impossible to develop. It also suggested that Thorn was experimenting, learning, adapting his techniques to this new environment with the same methodical patience he had probably applied to hunting elk or tracking wolves in Minnesota. The Wehrmacht file on Elias Thorn concluded with a stark assessment written by the intelligence officer who had compiled the information. Subject represents a fundamental tactical problem we are not equipped to solve. He operates outside our understanding of combat. Recommendation: avoid all non-essential movement in his operational area. He will kill until he chooses to stop, and we have no means to force that choice. That recommendation was filed on December 29, 1944. By then, Thorn had been active in the Ardennes for 11 days. German records documented 23 confirmed encounters with der Jäger, resulting in 31 casualties, none fatal, all psychologically devastating. American records from the same period showed no awareness that anything unusual was occurring. The 2nd Infantry Division had listed Elias Thorn as missing in action, presumed captured or killed. Nobody thought to look for him in the German rear areas, systematically dismantling enemy morale using skills he had learned tracking prey through the frozen wilderness of northern Minnesota. The forest had always been his home. The war had simply given him a reason to prove that civilization, with all its weapons and doctrines and hierarchies, still could not match a man who truly understood silence, patience, and the primal mathematics of predator and prey. The turning point came on January 2, 1945, when the Wehrmacht made a decision born of desperation. They would abandon tactical engagement entirely and instead attempt psychological contact. The plan was proposed by Dr. Friedrich Haas, a military psychiatrist attached to the 6th SS Panzer Army headquarters. Haas argued that Thorn, despite his lethal effectiveness, had shown a pattern of restraint. He incapacitated rather than killed. He warned rather than ambushed indiscriminately. This suggested an internal moral code, a boundary he would not cross. Perhaps, Haas theorized, he could be reasoned with, not as an enemy soldier, but as a man who had been forced into a situation he never wanted. The method was simple. German command drafted a message in English, printed on high-quality paper, and had it distributed throughout the forest in locations Thorn was known to frequent. The message was brief. To the American hunter operating in the Ardennes: "We know who you are, Elias Thorn of Minnesota. We know you are not a soldier by choice. We propose a truce. Return to your lines. We will cease all-night operations in this sector. No one else needs to disappear. You have proven your point. The forest is yours. Let it remain yours." They left copies at the site of his last known camp, pinned to trees along patrol routes, weighted with stones at trail intersections. They even included packages of dried food, tobacco, and ammunition, peace offerings that acknowledged his superiority. Officers waited 3 days for a response. What they received was not what they expected. On the morning of January 5th, a German sentry discovered a message nailed to a tree 50 meters from their command post. It was written on the back of one of their truce offers, using charcoal in crude but legible English. "I didn't ask for permission to be here. Don't need permission to leave. Stop sending men at night. They make too much noise. Disturbs the forest." The message was not a negotiation. It was a correction. Thorn was not claiming the forest through military dominance. He was simply stating a fact. The German presence was disruptive, and he wanted them to stop disturbing his environment. The implication was chilling. He did not see himself as a combatant. He saw himself as a resident protecting his territory from intruders. The war, from his perspective, was an inconvenience, a noisy invasion of armed strangers who did not understand how to move properly through his home. If this story surprised you, leave a like to help the channel. Dr. Haas analyzed the message with increasing unease. The language showed no military terminology, no acknowledgement of sides or factions. Thorn referred to men rather than soldiers, to the forest, as if it were a sentient entity deserving respect. This was not the mindset of a partisan or a resistance fighter. This was someone who had essentially gone feral, who identified more with the natural environment than with human conflict. The psychological implications were profound. They were not fighting a soldier who had learned woodland tactics. They were dealing with a woodland inhabitant who happened to be eliminating a human infestation. The German command sent another message, this time more direct. We will withdraw all patrols from the western sector. We ask only that you allow our wounded to be evacuated safely. A truce, not a surrender. They delivered this message the same way, left it at multiple locations, waited. The response came 36 hours later, written on a scrap of parachute silk. Already let 3 wounded go, found them lost in the snow, pointed them south. Next time, teach them how to read terrain. This revelation stunned intelligence officers. Thorn had encountered lost German soldiers and helped them find their way back rather than killing or capturing them. He distinguished between armed threats and helpless stragglers. His moral framework operated according to rules nobody could decipher, but which clearly existed and governed his actions with absolute consistency. He was not indiscriminately hostile. He was territorial. He eliminated threats to his domain, but showed mercy to those who posed no danger. The German forces interpreted this as an opening. If Thorn could be merciful, perhaps he could be negotiated with more substantively. They sent a final message, carried by a single unarmed medic who approached the forest at dawn with his hands raised and a white flag clearly visible. The medic carried a written proposal. The Wehrmacht would formally designate a 12-square-kilometer section of the Ardennes as neutral territory, off-limits to all German military activity. In exchange, Thorn would cease his operations and allow safe passage through adjacent areas. The medic returned 6 hours later with Thorn's response written on the same paper. Already neutral, was always neutral. You leave, it stays neutral. You stay, I stay. Simple. The message was infuriating in its simplicity. Thorn was not negotiating because he did not recognize the German authority to designate anything. The forest was neutral by nature, not by decree. The Wehrmacht could formalize their withdrawal all they wanted. It changed nothing about the fundamental reality that Thorn would protect his territory regardless of what papers were signed or what orders were issued. He operated according to a logic that predated nations and armies, a logic where boundaries were defined by presence and capability, not by political agreements. The German command faced an impossible choice. They could commit significant forces to clearing Thorn from the area, a costly operation that would drain resources from critical positions while the American advance continued elsewhere. Or they could accept his terms, which amounted to ceding terrain based on the threat of a single individual. Both options represented a kind of defeat. Traditional military doctrine had no framework for this situation. How did you write reports explaining that an entire sector had been abandoned because one hunter had proven psychologically undefeatable? On January 8, 1945, the Wehrmacht quietly began withdrawing forces from the Western Ardennes sector. No official announcement was made, no documentation filed explaining the tactical reasoning. Units were simply reassigned to other positions, patrols were rerouted, defensive lines were adjusted. The forest that Elias Thorne had claimed through patience and precision was left empty, a buffer zone that neither side officially acknowledged, but which both tacitly respected. American forces advancing through the area weeks later found abandoned German equipment, prepared defensive positions, supply caches, all left intact as if the occupants had simply vanished. Intelligence officers examining the abandoned positions noted strange details. German foxholes showed signs of hasty evacuation, personal items left behind, meals half-eaten, ammunition stored but not distributed. It suggested a withdrawal motivated by something other than tactical necessity. One American lieutenant discovered a German field journal in an abandoned command post. The final entry, dated January 7th, read, "Command has ordered withdrawal from Western Sector. Official reason, tactical repositioning. Real reason, der Jäger. We cannot fight what we cannot understand. The forest belongs to him. Let the Americans deal with it." But the Americans never encountered Thorne either. By the time their forces moved through the area in late January, he had vanished as completely as he had appeared. His camp was never found again. His tracks disappeared. The forest returned to ordinary silence, indistinguishable from thousands of other square kilometers of winter woodland. Some soldiers reported finding arrows embedded in trees, carved with marks that might have been trail signs or territorial markers. Others discovered small caches of food wrapped in parachute silk, hidden in locations that suggested they were meant to be found by specific individuals, perhaps wounded stragglers who might need emergency supplies. The 2nd Infantry Division never updated Thorne's status from missing in action. No body was recovered, no confirmation of death received. He existed in military records as a statistical anomaly, a draftee who disappeared during the Battle of the Bulge and was never accounted for. His personnel file contained a final notation added by a clerk processing casualty reports in March 1945. Presumed deceased. No remains recovered. No witnesses to death. Status MIA KEA. But German records told a different story. In the classified files that would remain sealed until 1988, Wehrmacht intelligence maintained a separate dossier on Elias Thorne that concluded with a very different assessment. Subject believed to be alive and active in Ardennes region as of January 1945, demonstrated capability to survive indefinitely without support. Tactical assessment, avoid engagement. Subject has established de facto territorial control through psychological dominance. Conventional military response not effective. Recommend permanent avoidance of operational area. The dossier included photographs of the messages Thorne had sent, analysis of his methods, psychological profiles prepared by 3 different military psychiatrists. It contained maps showing the locations of documented encounters, statistical breakdowns of casualty patterns, technical assessments of his handmade weapons. It was the most comprehensive file the Wehrmacht ever compiled on a single American soldier, and it concluded with a recommendation that was unprecedented in German military doctrine: retreat from an individual. Years after the war, a journalist researching unexplained events during the Battle of the Bulge obtained partial access to these files through Freedom of Information requests. He attempted to locate Elias Thorne, hoping to interview the man who had single-handedly forced a Wehrmacht withdrawal. Records showed that someone matching Thorne's description had been discharged from military service in May 1945, classified as psychologically unfit for peacetime transition. The discharge papers listed an address in Minnesota, the same remote region where he had worked before the war. The journalist traveled there in 1987 and found the area largely unchanged. Vast stretches of wilderness, scattered settlements, populations measured in dozens rather than thousands. Local officials remembered the name Elias Thorne, but could provide no recent information. Property records showed a cabin registered to him abandoned since the early 1950s. The journalist hiked to the location and found the structure collapsed, reclaimed by forest. Inside the ruins, he discovered a metal box containing personal items, hunting tools, a journal filled with sketches of animal tracks, and a single military decoration, a Purple Heart, still in its presentation case, unopened. The journalist published his findings in a regional history magazine. The article generated brief interest, then faded into obscurity. Elias Thorne remained what he had always been, a ghost, a story, a presence felt, but never fully confirmed. The forest had accepted him, and the forest kept its secrets. The aftermath of the Thorne incident rippled through Wehrmacht intelligence circles long after the war ended. During the Nuremberg trials and subsequent military tribunals, documents emerged that revealed the extent to which a single individual had disrupted German operations in a critical sector during a pivotal moment of the war. Prosecutors examining psychological warfare tactics discovered the sealed files, the panicked communications, the desperate attempts to negotiate with an enemy who operated outside all conventional frameworks. What fascinated post-war analysts was not the tactical impact. Thorne's actions had affected a relatively small area and had not significantly altered the broader outcome of the Battle of the Bulge. What fascinated them was the psychological mechanism by which fear had been weaponized so effectively. Wehrmacht soldiers had faced Soviet partisans, Allied bombers, superior armor, overwhelming artillery. They had developed tactical responses to all of it. But a single hunter using primitive weapons and ancient techniques had achieved what entire divisions could not: complete psychological dominance. Military psychologists studying the case identified several factors that made Thorne uniquely effective. First, his complete autonomy meant he could not be neutralized through standard counterinsurgency methods. No network to infiltrate, no supply chain to disrupt, no command structure to decapitate. He was a closed system, self-sufficient and self-directed. Second, his methods violated the unspoken rules of industrial warfare. Soldiers could accept death from artillery, from rifles, from airstrikes. These were understood mechanisms of modern combat. Being hunted with bows and arrows, being stalked and incapacitated through physical techniques that seemed to belong to another century, created cognitive dissonance that no amount of training could resolve. Third, and perhaps most significantly, Thorne had no interest in victory as it was conventionally understood. He was not trying to advance a position, capture territory, or inflict maximum casualties. He was simply defending space he had claimed as his own, using methods that felt personal and intimate in a way that mechanized warfare never could. German soldiers were not being killed by an enemy army. They were being eliminated by an individual who knew their patrol routes, understood their fears, and manipulated both with predatory intelligence. The American military showed little interest in the Thorne case after the war. He had operated without authorization, had ignored chain of command, and had achieved results through methods that could not be systematized or replicated. The few officers who reviewed the German files concluded that Thorne represented an anomaly, a unique combination of skills, psychology, and circumstance that could not be weaponized into doctrine. The army briefly considered attempting to recruit similar individuals for specialized operations, but abandoned the idea after psychological evaluations revealed that the personality traits required for Thorne-style operations were fundamentally incompatible with military service. What remained were questions that no official investigation could answer. Had Thorne intended to create the psychological impact he achieved, or was it an accidental byproduct of his survival instincts? Was his restraint, his pattern of incapacitating rather than killing, evidence of moral principle or tactical calculation? Did he understand that he was fighting a war? Or did he simply perceive the German presence as a disruption to be managed like any other threat in his environment? The only person who might have answered these questions was Thorn himself, and he had vanished more completely after the war than he had during it. The journalist who located his abandoned cabin in the 1980s found no evidence that Thorn had maintained contact with human society after his discharge. No bank accounts, no employment records, no medical visits, no interactions with government agencies. He had simply walked back into the forest and disappeared, leaving behind only rumors and occasional unconfirmed sightings. One such report, filed with Minnesota Fish and Wildlife in 1963, described an incident where two hunters became lost in a blizzard and stumbled upon a primitive shelter. An elderly man was inside, said nothing, gestured for them to enter, shared food and warmth until the storm passed, then pointed them toward the nearest trail and vanished back into the woods before they could thank him. The hunters provided a description that matched Thorn's age and general appearance. When rangers investigated the location, they found no shelter, no tracks, no evidence anyone had been there. The German veterans who survived encounters with Der Jäger rarely spoke about the experience. Those who did described it in terms that mixed respect with lingering unease. They did not talk about fighting an enemy. They talked about being inside something's territory, being tolerated or rejected based on criteria they could not understand. One veteran, interviewed in 1979, provided perhaps the most honest assessment. "We thought we were fighting a war. He was just living his life. We were the intruders. He was the resident. All our training, all our equipment, all our doctrine. It meant nothing because we were operating in his world, not ours." The final confirmed reference to Elias Thorn appeared in a Minnesota County Coroner's report from 1971. A forest ranger discovered human remains in a remote area, skeletal, partially scattered by animals, impossible to identify without dental records. Near the remains was a recurved bow, handmade, showing decades of careful maintenance. The wood was ash, the string was sinew, the design matched no commercial pattern. In 2003, a researcher comparing photographs to images from the German files confirmed a match. If the remains were Thorn's, he had lived to approximately 73 years old, had spent his final decades in complete isolation, and had died in the forest that had always been his true home. The location was noted in the report: 47 miles from the nearest road, in terrain accessible only on foot, in a region where winter temperatures routinely drop to 30 below zero. It was not a place where someone accidentally ended up. It was a place someone chose. The bow was eventually donated to a small historical museum in northern Minnesota. It sits in a display case labeled Unidentified Hunter, circa 1970s. Visitors occasionally stop to admire the craftsmanship, the elegant simplicity of its design. They do not know its history. They do not know that this weapon once forced the Wehrmacht to redraw their tactical maps, that it represented the moment when ancient skills proved superior to modern doctrine. The museum curator, when asked about the bow's origins, can only say, "We believe it belonged to a wilderness guide, someone who knew the forest better than anyone. Beyond that, we know nothing." And perhaps that is the most appropriate epitaph for Elias Thorn. Known by his absence, defined by his silence, remembered not through monuments or medals, but through the negative space he created, the patrols that did not return, the territory that was quietly ceded, the fear that persisted long after he had vanished. He had fought a war without seeking victory, had claimed ground without planting flags, had left a legacy documented entirely by those who failed to capture him. The complete story of Elias Thorn emerged only in fragments over subsequent decades, assembled from scattered sources that each held pieces of a puzzle no one had known existed. The full German intelligence file was declassified in 1988, revealing the extent of Wehrmacht communications about Der Jäger. American military records released in the 1990s provided discharge documentation and psychiatric evaluations. Minnesota County archives yielded bits of civilian history, property transfers, tax records, occasional reports about a reclusive man who appeared in town once or twice a year. What they revealed was a life that had always been defined by distance. Thorne had been born in 1897 in a logging camp in northern Minnesota, raised by a father who worked timber operations and a mother who had died when he was 7. His formal education ended before 4th grade. He learned to read from his father's limited library, hunting manuals, navigation texts, a few technical books on forestry. He learned everything else from direct experience. By age 15, Thorne was working as a guide for wealthy sportsmen. By 20, he had built his own cabin on land he purchased for almost nothing because it was too remote to be commercially valuable. Census records showed him listed at that address through 1940, though enumerators noted difficulty locating him. He appeared in town records occasionally, paying property taxes, renewing hunting licenses, selling furs to traders. Beyond these bureaucratic touchpoints, he existed in a space the modern world rarely penetrated. The psychiatric evaluation conducted when he was drafted in 1944 provided the most detailed contemporary description. The examining doctor noted, "Subject demonstrates profound discomfort with enclosed spaces, artificial lighting, and prolonged social contact. Displays exceptional spatial reasoning and environmental awareness, but struggles with abstract concepts. Communication is functional but minimal. Assessment, cognitively functional but temperamentally unsuited for military structure." Military service records showed Thorne struggling with every aspect of conventional training. He could not march in formation. His natural gait was adapted to uneven terrain. He could not follow orders that contradicted his survival instincts. He questioned logistics that seemed inefficient. Instructors found him simultaneously infuriating and impressive. He could not master basic drill, but could infiltrate any position and survive on resources other soldiers never noticed. His deployment to Europe had been almost accidental. He arrived in France in November 1944, was assigned to the 2nd Infantry Division, and was in the Ardennes when the German offensive began on December 16th. His unit was scattered, forced to retreat. In the chaos, Thorne simply walked away from the column and into the forest. Whether he intended to desert or simply sought familiar terrain is unclear. The result was the same. He vanished into an environment that felt more like home than any military base ever had. What happened next can be reconstructed from the German records. Thorne established himself in the forest, began observing German patrols, recognized them as threats to his immediate territory, and addressed that threat using the only methods he knew. He did not plan a guerrilla campaign. He simply defended the space he occupied with the same practical efficiency he would use to drive wolves away from his cabin. The fact that his targets were armed soldiers rather than wild animals changed nothing about his fundamental approach. The psychological impact he created was never his primary objective. It was a side effect of his methodology. That he chose non-lethal methods when possible reflected not strategic calculation, but ingrained principle. Thorne had spent his life taking only what he needed from the forest, never more. He applied the same ethic to human targets. After the war, his return to Minnesota represented not a retreat, but a homecoming. Military discharge papers showed he was released in May 1945 with a notation of psychological unsuitability for peacetime adjustment. He accepted his discharge without comment, took his small amount of back pay, and disappeared. The decades that followed left almost no trace. The few confirmed sightings described a man who moved through wilderness with silent efficiency, who helped lost hikers without speaking, and vanished before they could ask questions. Park rangers occasionally found evidence of his presence, campsites that showed exceptional woodcraft, trail markers carved in a personal code. They knew someone was living deep in the backcountry year-round, but attempts to make contact always failed. What remained was legacy, not in monuments or official records, but in the spaces between documentation. The German files that admitted defeat to an individual. The American discharge papers that acknowledged failure to convert wilderness expertise into military utility. The county records that tracked a man through absence rather than presence. The museum bow that represented skills the modern world had largely forgotten. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following the story of Elias Thorne. See you in the next video. The war ended, but the forest still holds the memory of what should not have been forged. The collision between industrial violence and ancient understanding, between armies that moved in columns and a man who moved like water through stone. In the Ardennes, in the winter of 1944, the forest learned to defend itself using hands that had been shaped by Minnesota cold and decades of silence. When those hands finally stilled in 1971, they left no trace except in the nightmares of old soldiers and the incomplete files of historians who could never quite explain how one hunter had rewritten the rules of engagement simply by refusing to acknowledge that any rules had changed. The steel and doctrine of modern warfare met something older that winter. The steel broke first, and the forest, as always, kept its accounting.